Hello, and welcome to this training video on the new version of HIFIS 4. This video is intended for service providers that use HIFIS 4 in the region of Waterloo's housing stability system. The region is upgrading HIFIS 4 with the latest version of the software, which will include a number of new features to help us understand and serve our community better. Before you continue, please make sure that you have your HIFIS Release 59 self-guided training checklist in front of you. We'll walk through the new features that are listed in the checklist. You can pause the video to test out the new features in the HIFIS demo site as we go along. So here on the screen, you'll see a copy of the checklist, and it's broken down into 5 parts. So in section A, we'll talk about the new login process. This is pretty straightforward. Previously, so in the old version of HIFIS, you would enter your login and password, and then you would select a service provider from the drop-down list. And now HIFIS will select a default service provider for you, so you no longer have to select from that menu. So I'll take us to the HIFIS demo site so that you can see how that looks. So here we are on the HIFIS demo site. You can see that this is not the Region of Waterloo HIFIS database. This is the demo.hifis.ca site. So here you would enter your your username and your password, and there's no longer a drop down for service providers. So if you have any issues with this when you log in on the region's HIFIS site, or if you have multiple service providers, so you work for multiple organizations, you can talk with the HIFIS lead at one of your organizations to solve that problem. So we'll log in here, and we can move along to the next section of the checklist. So section B talks about the new coordinated access module. So this is one of the more substantial changes in the database. So if we navigate here to front desk, you can see that coordinated access is now listed here. So not everybody in the region of Waterloo will have access to view this module. You will have access if you need it for the purposes of your job. But if you do have access, then you'll see it in the menu. You can click here. So the coordinated access module will essentially serve as the region of Waterloo's by name list. And so what this means is it will list every client who is currently experiencing homelessness according to HIFIS, as long as they have an active record in HIFIS and as long as they've provided the appropriate consent. So what you would see here is a list of anyone who's currently homeless, and all of this information about each client in this module. You could, if you wanted, export that for sorting purposes, and you can also filter here. So you'd select on the filter options button, and there's a number of different criteria that you can use to filter. So for example, you wanted to just look at youth, could select those fields under age, and maybe you want to just look at youth and their very first time with a homeless episode. So you would apply filters, and that will narrow down the list to that subset for you. So as I mentioned, not everybody will have access to this module, but every person who uses HIFIS to add new clients will need to make sure that every client has the appropriate consent to be able to appear in this list. So here we can see the results. There's just one entry from this small fake data set that met our criteria. And so just that one name is appearing now in the list. So what we can do next is look at the consent, what's changed with consent. So if we go here to clients and imagine that we are adding a new client. So going forward, anytime you have a new client that is entering the housing stability system, you would be asking them to sign the the HSS consent form, the same form that we've always been using. And rather than selecting explicit consent from this dropdown, what you would do is select coordinated access plus explicit. So you select that option for every client that has signed the consent form, unless of course they have declined, in which case you continue to use that declined anonymous option. But for everyone that signs, we now want to select coordinated access plus explicit. You use the date that they signed the form as the start date, and you do not need an expiry date, and then you would add the attachment as you normally do. And so what this does is it ensures that everybody who's in HIFIS, who's experiencing homelessness and has an active record in HIFIS, will in fact appear in that coordinated access module so that staff can use it as a by name list and that it's accurate. So the next piece that staff will need to be aware of is some new features relating to housing history. So if you are following along in your checklist, you'll see we're on section C of the checklist, and there's a number of new housing history features that are all intended to help us keep housing history accurate. And the reason that this is really important now, even more so than before, is because this coordinated access module uses the information about a client in HIFIS to determine whether a person would appear on the list. And so it determines, based on housing history and shelter admissions, whether a person's currently homeless or not. And whether, based on their history, they qualify as being chronically homeless. So let's take a look at a few of those new features. So actually, the first feature is around adding new clients. So we're already on that page. So if you scroll down, so imagining that we are still adding a new client, as I mentioned, you would select this coordinated access plus explicit. You would complete all of the fields as you normally would. But now you'll see at the bottom here under add housing history, this is a new field, and you can toggle here to yes. And this allows you to actually add a client's housing history, the most recent housing history that they have, without having to separately go to housing history to add that information. So this is a little bit easier. And let's say the person is maybe sitting in front of you and you're going through this, and you can ask them, where are they staying right now prior to coming to speak with you? And maybe you know that they're couch surfing right now, maybe for the past couple of weeks. Then you could enter that information here. And if you did have additional information over the past, weeks or months, you can go into the actual housing history module to add that as well, if you like. So that's something that's intended to make it easier for us to get housing history information into HIFIS. Another piece, if we go to an existing client in HIFIS, so let's say this is somebody that has perhaps used services a number of times, and now they're back at a later date, and you open their file, and you might see now there's this new reminder or notice that says the housing history is out of date. Please update the client's housing history. So that you will see if no information has been updated in the last 30 days, or if they don't have a housing history record at all for the current time period. So it provides you a link right here to go directly there if you're able to add that information. So the last piece that's new about housing history is right in the module, what you're able to view um, is a consolidated list of the client's housing history, which not only includes their manually added housing history records, it also includes their shelter stays. So previously you would just see this makeshift street and this co-op housing record, but now it's also pulling their shelter stay information from the admissions module and displaying all of that here so that you can really see at a glance what their housing history is like. If for some reason you don't want to see all of the shelter information, you can still use this button here to hide the stays, and then it'll just show you those manual um, entries instead. But by default, it will show you all of those things. So the next item in the checklist is section D. There are a couple of new fields in HIFIS that show up here. So if we're still on the same client here, but underneath their profile picture, there's this little information box, and you will see a new field called client state. So client state is a really helpful field to be able to see at a glance whether a client is currently active or if they're inactive. And so in the regions database, anyone that has a service recorded in HIFIS within the last 120 days will be considered active. If they don't have any records within that time period, they'll be listed as inactive. And so that could be anything like a shelter stay or a SPDAT record um, or pretty much any other record in HIFIS. You may also see two other client state options. So deceased can be manually updated for client state as well as archived. And so those are things that your HIFIS lead in your organization can help you with if needed. The other really helpful field here that's new in the same information box is housing status. So housing status is another field that's automatically populated based on the information that we include in HIFIS. So again, this is why we want to be really diligent about adding housing history because this field here is populated based on that information. So if we have a complete history of somebody's housing, then it would accurately record or display here whether they're chronically homeless, or you would see for some clients homeless, you could see housed, you could see transitionally housed, or you could also see unknown, and that would be in the event that there's no housing history record for the current start or end, like there's no active housing history record for that client. So those are the 5 options that you might see there. And as I said, it's all based on what's included in HIFIS. And if you are interested in kind of understanding which of the options count as homeless or which count as housed, that again is something that your HIFIS lead could provide to you a bit more information about what's called the HIFIS housing continuum and how all those definitions are laid out in HIFIS. So those are the 5 main areas where you will see changes in the new release of HIFIS. So let's go back to the checklist and we'll just do a really quick review. So section A, we talked about the new login process, no longer having to select your service provider. Section B, we talked about the new coordinated access module. So that's going to house the region's by name list with every person who's currently homeless. And the big takeaway there for everybody is that going forward, we want to start selecting coordinated access plus explicit for every new client that signs the consent form. We went through the new housing history features. So there's the reminders and the notices and some different functionalities for adding information and viewing information. We talked about the new client state field and the new housing status field. So both of those are available to view in the information box and give you sort of easy at a glance information about the client that you are serving. The last thing to note is just that there are also a few new updated drop-down options under service provider types or service offered types throughout the database in some different modules. So you'll see prevention and diversion included in some drop-down menus, and street outreach and housing support. And another change is that where previously you would have seen the value Aboriginal in either field names or dropdowns, that will be replaced with the value Indigenous going forward in the new release. So that's a summary of what you will see in the new release. Any questions or comments you can direct to the HIFIS lead at your organization, and you can also feel free to play around in the HIFIS demo site if you want to try any of those new features. You can also, on Friday, April 23rd, you will be able to see how some of those new features look in the region's local HIFIS site. So thank you for watching, and thank you so much for all the great work that you do to end homelessness in Waterloo Region.